one last question about Putin's mindset then. What are his actual, do you think, motivations? Because there's so much debate that this was materialistic and pragmatically driven. Simply, do you think was his primary motivation for all of this? Buffer against NATO, control Ukraine, restoration of Russian Empire or Soviet Union?
I mean, if you look at the Ukrainian question, if you look at it sort of more strategically, the rational side of the system, one is to re-exert Russian control over its and hegemony over its periphery. So Ukraine, Belarus, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. I think that because Russia equates territory with security, so having a sphere of influence, quote unquote, a near abroad, quote unquote, is it still drives the Russian security thought.
This is the Global Gambit.
All right, well, welcome back, everybody. It is time for another episode, and as we've been largely doing for much of September, focusing on Ukraine and Russia because of the developments. There's a lot going on, and we've had many different guests, quite a few different perspectives, some of which you like, some of which you don't like, but the point of the programme here is not to be repetitive and be an echo chamber. The topics of conversation here vary. We look at the nexus of geopolitical risk and economics, and we try to be a bit more diversified in our approach to things. I'm speaking with this time around, though. Well, I don't know even really what's the best way to introduce him. He's a man of many different accolades. I think John Foreman, CBE here in the UK. He's been the Defence Attache for Moscow and Kiev, and he's a retired Royal Navy officer. And I'm very delighted to have him on.
Thank you, Piotr.
Yeah, thank you, John. It's you're coming from Suffolk, as we were touching on air. But one of the things I wanted to start with, I think, for you was you wrote an article in The Spectator where you do produce a lot of great pieces. But the one that I did read and was what I think triggered me to reach out was how you sort of said NATO has fudged, quote, support for Ukraine again. Could you unpack a little bit of that article, obviously now in the more recent context of Starmer's visit to Washington and the seeming non-change in policy between NATO towards allowing Ukraine to use long-range missiles?
Sure. Well, I think the fudging went back to the Bucharest summit in, I think, 2008, when NATO said that Ukraine will be a member of NATO without actually saying when and how in that process. And rather than giving a membership action plan, they gave this thing called an annual national programme, which sort of kicked the stone down the road. Go forward to 2014, the West didn't obviously deal with that head-on, the situation of the annexation of Crimea and the introduction of Russian irregulars into Donbass. They didn't provide any form of security guarantees or assurances further towards Ukraine. And then we have the situation after the invasion in 2022 in the potential or the prospect of NATO membership has been dangled like a carrot in front of the Ukrainians without actually any movement towards it. So I think back in looking at Washington, I fully expected there to be not tremendous progress. I mean, if you notice, there was talk about funding, and the allies agreed to provide £40 billion or €40 billion, but only annually, but not giving the security and certainty that Ukraine needed to actually be able to use that money to lease contracts. There was no movement towards membership at all. So with that, the documents which have been signed between various allies in Ukraine about security assurances or security promises don't actually equal a security guarantee. So it's left, as people said, I think the president or the prime minister of Lithuania said it's left Ukraine in this grey zone, and Poland, that until that issue of Ukrainian security is addressed head on by issuing security guarantees, and the vehicle for that is NATO, it'll leave Ukraine vulnerable to further Russian attacks. So although there was some good work done at Washington, it didn't actually, I think, really help, and it was another fudge. And I think that's been seen in the sort of approach afterwards in terms of the missiles, giving permission to use long-range missiles into Russia. The same approach has occurred. So there's been lots of talk about standing shoulder to shoulder and ironclad, but actually no real movement on that, which again has leave Ukraine fighting with one hand tied behind its back.
Yeah, I try to draw a balance between staying relatively in the here and now, but also thinking and considering the historical context of there and then, because it's important too. But I find sometimes if we focus too much just on the past, and we kind of well, we need to also think about where we're going. So it's a balance, I guess. And well, very quickly, I do have a question, though, because one of the things that we hear a lot from Kremlinites, people who are obviously there to propagandize the reality of the past and where we've led up to here is sort of that Ukraine and the whole neutrality. And that if Ukraine was just going to be neutral, then this would have been avoided, and Putin wouldn't have done what he did, and had NATO not pressured Ukraine to join, or this oppressive expansionist entity, all these sorts of rhetorical words. But from my understanding, look at things historically, Ukraine in the turn of the 2010s was quite open to the idea of neutrality, wasn't it? Sort of an Austrian model or a Finlandization kind of thing. But, how do you see that?
When it changed from the Orange government. I was there when they changed the Orange government across to the Yanukovych government. Yanukovych changed the constitution. He renounced movement towards NATO. He said there would still be European track, which he then reneged on in 2013. They changed the constitution to say that Ukraine had a multi-vector foreign policy, which meant neutrality. And that would therefore meet the Russian demands. Ukraine could be a bridge or a buffer between East and West. Because that didn't satisfy Mr. Putin, because he quickly annexed Crimea, started Dirty War in Donbass, and now has conducted the full-scale invasion in 2022. But having said that, just before the war, Russia issued these demands on Ukraine and on the West, termed it security guarantees for themselves, security assurances. And in there, I think there was talk about Ukrainian membership, whatever. And I'll be quite honest, as I said before, Ukrainian membership of NATO was not on the cards in 2022 at all. And the Russians were told this directly, in writing and verbally by leaders, and he still invaded. So I think this whole idea that if Ukraine had stayed neutral, Russia wouldn't have invaded is a myth, it's a fantasy, and it's a lie by the Kremlin, because I think Putin's obsession with Ukraine started in the early 2000s. As soon as he came into office and he started interfering with the political process in there. I mean, the same thing goes for enlargement, which is the polite term, or expansion, which is the Russian talking point. Mr. Putin is responsible for the greatest, most recent enlargement of NATO by invading Ukraine, having now secured Finland and Sweden into the alliance. Mr. Putin's responsible for a 1,300-kilometre border now between Finland, NATO, Finland, and Russia. It's Mr. Putin's threats who've actually driven independent democracies to seek membership, which is their sovereign democratic right to do so. And the other great democracies of Europe have agreed to do that. So there's no Western plot. There's no us trying to shove countries into NATO. So it's their free will. And I think it's Ukraine's free will. And I think if that's the free will of the Ukrainians and actually it interests our security, as I said before, we should be getting Ukraine into NATO to ensure its security and prevent further aggression from Mr. Putin.
Putin remains a master strategist. I think that is the point. Or as I preferably have just come up with the sense that, Putin's poker face is good, but his chess game is shit, frankly. And I think that has been...
Yeah, I've never thought he's a great strategist, to be honest. I think there is I think you could determine a sort of strategy which appeared around about the pandemic, or maybe before, about finally solving the Ukrainian solution, finally solving the Ukrainian question in 2022. We had the military modernization being there for 10 years. That started and that finished in 2022 or 2021. We had all the demands, the mad articles about Russia and Ukraine being one fraternal people and Ukraine not being a real country and being invented by Lenin, all this sort of stuff. Nord Stream had been finished, so they could bypass Ukraine pipelines, and then the rhetoric was ramped up. So, I think there has been a strategy. I think the strategy at home has also been to repress the population and bake in some mad ideology, and abroad is to try and divide the West and reduce its support for Ukraine to leave Ukraine isolated, none of which has worked. So I think there was a sort of loose strategy which turned to dust in 2022, which they've been scrabbling to catch up with ever since.
Yeah, I mean, strategy is a pretty broad term. We can talk about grand strategy of the entire state,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
military strategy at the sort of specific level of the Ukrainian campaign. We can talk about strategy from a perspective of individual desire. I think what I'm specifically referring to is military strategy, right? One last question on this more sort of historical
just on
segment, if
that,
you
I would
like.
say military. Just very quickly, military strategy,
Right.
military strategic level strategy should accord with
Yeah.
the grand strategy. So, the development of the Russian armed forces, a defensive force to repel aggression, quote quote, from America and our allies, was not the military which was needed to invade a sovereign country of 40 million people. And that's why Russia came up short in 2022. So there was a disconnect between the ends and ways and means, and that's what I think was at the root of the failure to take Kiev in 3 days or 2 weeks, whatever the intention was.
Yeah, I mean, there's been analysis done on the fact that the FSB and the security services led the initial 3 days invasion because they thought that the Ukrainians would welcome the Russians, and then there would be this sort of administrative development with the military helping to implement that. It wasn't led by a conventional military. I think that's generally the Imperial War Museum have done a fantastic video on that I think about or refer back to as baseline for these sorts of things. But going back a little bit
I
more
would
on
say I would
the
just challenge that and say
annexation
when I
of
was
Crimea.
sorry, I'll just say sorry, Piotr.
Right.
There's a delay. I would just say on that is that we were well aware of the military, sort of the Russian planning, as has become public subsequently in the good offices of the New York Times, the Washington Post. So we had a pretty good handle, or the West had a pretty good handle on the state of planning. That's why our minister, Ben Wallace, went to Moscow in February 22, because we knew where they were. It's not fair to say, I think, that it was just an FSB-led planning. This was involving military intelligence and the military and the FSB and the other parts of government. It was floor planning because it was based on
What I'm saying
poor
is that
assumptions.
it was led by the FSB. Obviously, it involved every element of the defence and military ministries. That goes without saying. I'm just saying that the initial actual activities. Anyway, what I would like to do is actually try to get back to what we were talking about before, which is that, you mentioned about the reasons why Crimea was annexed, but one of the reasons I think is quite misunderstood or not mentioned enough, at least in Western dialogue, is the Snow Revolution of 2012, and this whole idea that the growing, shall we say, educated parts, the urban populations of Russia standing up in defiance or protest against the restructuring of the constitution by Putin so that he could run for an unlimited amount of terms, right? I think this was a huge element that a reason why Putin felt he needed to annex Crimea was because it would re-legitimize his leadership, install that new sense of nationalism. How often have we seen strong men do that in the past? They lead. I'm thinking what happened in Argentina with the Falklands, right? To regain sort of some kind of validation with the population, he tried to, take the Falklands. So I don't know if you'd agree with that sentiment, but that's sort of from your perspective, because you said you were in Kiev at the time. Is that something that was being seen?
I left in Kiev I left 2011, and then obviously Putin comes back to power after the sort of passing the baton between himself and Mr. Medvedev. And I think he was second term Putin, or whatever we are now, third term Putin. It was very different from second term Putin. And I think his sort of worldview and his conspiratorialism and his suspicion, his paranoia, sort of ramped up, in particular because of the Bolotna demonstrations. I wouldn't call it a snow revolution because it didn't lead to any change, but that sort of period definitely led to clamp down on freedoms in Russia, clamp down on political parties, clamp down on protests. There's the style of persecution, people like Navalny, and indeed sense that this world is against us. Russia is a besieged outpost of civilization, with Americans, the Allies, trying to contain it and do it down. And I think, in 2013, he saw his opportunity. I think whether it's, we know that he has said himself that there was only 3 or 4 men, all men, in the room with him when he decided to annex Crimea. And so I think the annexation of Crimea and the subsequent sort of dirty war in Donbass fell into his lap because of the situation in Ukraine when Yanukovych turned away from Europe and the people came out onto the streets. So I think that caught him on the hop, but he took advantage of that. He saw the opportunity and did it. And I think that was what stage 1 or stage 2 or whatever it is of his intention to basically subjugate Ukraine and destroy its statehood and its nationhood and reabsorb it in some sort of Anschluss into Russia proper.
Yeah, there's definitely been different phases of Putin, I think, since he took office, if you like, since 2000. I think it's well, there's a couple of different people, I guess you could say, who said that there are different phases. He had his first phase where he was quite sort of open to collaboration with the West. Then you had the second phase after Georgia in 2007, Munich. Then you had Crimea, and now you've got his fourth phase, which was really, I think, expanded upon due to COVID. What do you think his frame of mind is now after the war's going? I mean, it's difficult to obviously be in the mind of such a lunatic, but how do we sort of try to rationalize Putin's, he says there are all these red lines, but nothing is ever followed through. He talks about, glorification of Russian losses and motherland and sort of reclamation of glory days, resurgency of Russia, even though I don't think anyone would have forgotten Russia, considering how many nuclear warheads it has. How do we sort of try to normalize or understand Putin's perspective?
The first thing I would say is, before the war and now, we still don't have great insight into Putin's decision-making calculus and his intent. Now, there's lots of stuff projected onto Putin from those in the West, and a lot of it's wishful thinking, optimism bias. So before the war, people were saying, well, he wouldn't do this because of the consequences for Russia, but he did it anyway. And people projected after the Prigozhin mutiny that this was shaking the foundations of Putin's rule and that Putin's days are numbered. And you saw the same thing after the Crocus Hall massacre, and you've seen it recently after the limited Ukrainian incursion into Russia. So we don't have great insight into his intent, his risk versus reward calculus, those sort of things. Having said that, I don't think he's a madman. I think he's rational within his own lens. He sees the world in a certain way. It's all written down for us, the national security strategy in his speeches. He says what he thinks. And if you can pick from there his determination to see this war through, not only because he thinks it's part of his legacy and his manifest destiny to reabsorb Ukraine into Russia, but also part of this sort of conflict he sees with the West, of which the central front for him at present is Ukraine. So we shouldn't, I think, portray him as mad, because that's just othering and it gets in the way of us understanding how the Russian system works and his rule. I think on Russia itself, I think the war is absorbing everything. Russia's becoming this, well, sort of, somebody called it deathonomics, or the cult of death, which has sort of crept through Russia. The huge numbers of casualties, both dead and injured, the damage to the economy, the damage to wider Russian society of returnees, the degradation of basic moral standards, the way they talk about Ukrainians as vermin and lice and parasites, dehumanizing language which is straight out of the 1930s towards Jews. So I think the damage it's doing to Russia, its overall health, is catastrophic. And I don't believe the argument that Russia is, its economy is doing well or is booming. So I think it's saving up an awful lot of problems for the future, because Putin's mortgaging the future of Russia to win his his wicked war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I want to come to your perspective, given you were there until very before the full-scale invasion, but on the economy. But one last question about Putin's mindset then. What are his actual, do you think, motivations? Because there's so much debate that this was materialistic and pragmatically driven. And many people were like, Putin is not an ideological man. When I was doing my master's and studying Russia and doing what I did to understand it, dissertations at the time he annexed Crimea, the idea was that Putin was very calculated based on pragmatism and not ideologically driven. And then he writes this massive piece in July 21, and it completely shocks a lot of people who thought they knew him, because it's like, well, this guy clearly is, maybe ideologically isn't the right word, but certainly motivated by symbolism and historical association. Yeah. So what, simply, do you think was his primary motivation for all of this? Buffer against NATO, control Ukraine, restoration of Russian Empire or Soviet Union?
Yeah, I mean, I think. If you look at the Ukrainian question, if you look at it sort of more strategically, the rational side of the system, one is to re-exert Russian control over its and hegemony over its periphery. So, Ukraine, Belarus, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. I think that because Russia equates territory with security, so having a sphere of influence, quote unquote, a near abroad, quote unquote, is it still drives the Russian security thought. The second one, I think, is to divide the West to get the Americans out of Europe. In particular, that was in part of his security demands just before the war, that Eastern Europe would be demilitarized back to sort of state as it was about 1994, and that American nuclear missiles and tactical nuclear weapons would be removed from Europe. And I think the third sort of rational geopolitical motivation is to re-establish Russia, quote, as a great power, unquote. I don't think it has the potential or the influence or the friends to do that, but that's their ambition. And to, instead of us collaborating and working together, it's a dog-eat-dog competitive world between various zones or poles: Russia, China, Europe, America. So I think that's the rational side. But I think there is that sort of rational, or say less rational, motivations about hurt after the breakup of the Soviet Union, his upbringing in the 50s and 60s and 70s, of the loss of Ukraine, or the fear of Ukrainian democracy to his misrule in Russia, and his regime stability and security. And also, I think, just the sort of feeling that when Ukraine became independent, there was a sense of a phantom limb or an amputation, and I think that has driven an awful lot. So, when England or Great Britain lost Ireland, people wrote about this sort of amputation feel. With Ireland had been part of UK or England for a very, very long time. It's taken us how long to get over it? 100 years. Similarly, you can say, well, the loss of Ukraine on their borders has a sort of security dimension, but also has a sort of national resonance towards your self-identity. And I think he's trying to resolve that as part of his belief that he's a major figure in Russian history, and he has the one, quote, who stabilized and made Russia great again.
Oh God, don't apply that phrase to. Oh God. No, I think IR scholars, geopolitical analysts, theorists will say that this whole idea of great power, statehood, is something that you can have niche powers, right? You can have countries that are a great power because they've got a lot of nuclear weapons, or they're a great power because they've got unprecedented cultural influence. There's lots of but then we get slightly too academics. I don't want to go down there too much for viewers who will nod off, perhaps, from maybe me nerding out. Maybe you're a bit more normal as well against that. But but quips aside. So what do you think then about the actual bringing it more into the present? What do you think about the situation for the economics of both countries? I kind of want to do a comparative analysis from your experiences of being in both countries. Obviously, a lot of Kremlinites like to emphasize that Ukraine's economy is shot, that they're completely dependent on the West, and that there is nothing that they can do once, the West pulls out, or if Trump wins and there's a reduction in support. The Ukrainian economy and therefore system and government will crumble. And whilst Russia's perhaps in a delicate position, they're much more resilient against the sanctions and so on. What do you do from your experiences having been there in both?
Well, I think the Ukrainian economy has always been, in comparison to Russia's, and also comparison to, say, Poland's, as it was before the end of the Cold War, that Poland's and Ukrainian economies were broadly similar, but now Poland's is probably 5 times the size. And this is because Ukraine didn't do the structural reforms it needed to do in the 1990s and 2000s, and because of endemic corruption and misrule by the elites, who were more interested in making themselves rich than actually helping out their country. Now, I think an awful lot has changed since 2014. I think lots changed since 2020, 2022. And actually, the Ukrainian economy is growing, although having suffered a considerable contraction in 2022. So I think they're under the cosh. I think the major concern I have is not business per se, it's energy. It's through the winter into next year. And Russia, of course, has been targeting that as part of their campaign to degrade Ukrainian energy infrastructure. The second thing I have concerns about Ukraine is demography. not only the damage of the casualties at the front, killed and wounded, but also those who've left occupied territories and occupied territories, and disruptions to supply chains. So Ukraine has done a great job of sort of keeping going, and I think European and World Bank, IMF support to Ukraine is absolutely vital to keep it sustained in the war. I think for Russia, I mean, the party line is, or the Kremlin line is, everything's doing well, we're booming, but I think it's under extreme pressure. There's considerable demand for war related stocks, equipment, and there's not the supply of people and technology for it, which sanctions are. So there's a bit of a crunch. I think the ruble's under great pressure. I think that, which is causing imports to go up. Russian exports have gone down, especially to their closer markets. They're having to borrow. They can't borrow money on the international markets. They're using up their strategic reserve of funding. So you have to get past the myth of saying, well, the Russian economy is doing well. It's I think the problems are going to come closer and closer. And I think even the chair of the Russian Federal Reserve has said something similar, that things are going, and she's pretty honest, and she said things are strained. So we'll have to see. I think how's that play into living standards? Because if everything goes to the war, everything's going to tank production or repairs or ammunition. What happens to the rest of the economy? What happens to living standard, education, investment in roads? So I think Putin is, again, saving problems up for himself in the future, but I think he probably calculates he can keep a lid on any protest due to that and keep the support for the war going at the expense of the wider economy.
Yeah, I think Elvira Nabiullina, who is the current governor, I think she's been quite effective, actually. And if anything, actually sort of not rejected, but sidestepped some of Putin's suggestions and has done a remarkable job of just objectively keeping the economy, this wartime economy, being quite resilient to the sanctions. But one of the things you mentioned, which I do appreciate in the fact that you're being pretty reasonable in your responses, is that people who I speak to who are Russian, or even who are more skeptical about Ukraine's government or something, people who aren't necessarily 100% behind Ukraine, but they're anti-Putin at the same time, one of the things they do talk about is the systemic corruption. Now, as we've acknowledged that Ukraine has made strides to addressing that in ways that Russia hasn't, but there are still concerns that sort of Ukraine has this embedded problem that would make it a setback if it were to join NATO, and why some people are apprehensive or even against Ukrainian full-scale membership to NATO. What's your perspective on that?
Objectively, Ukraine has done tremendous work to address corruption in terms of its these world rankings of Transparency International, ease of doing business, and has finally taken legislative steps to address it. But Ukraine's got long history of corruption. I think that corruption held the country back for 20 years. In fact, it probably led to Putin thinking he could, firstly, annex Crimea, and secondly, conduct the full-scale invasion. That it had undermined the society. Didn't turn out to be true because of the resilience and fortitude of the Ukrainian people. The other question I say about corruption is look at Bulgaria and Romania. So before people start to point the finger, the point of having international institutions, the EU and NATO, is to provide benchmarks for dealing with these problems. And we know that Ukraine is now a candidate country for the European Union. European membership comes with a significant, in the acquis communautaire, comes with a huge set of criteria hoops you have to jump through. And at each stage, Ukraine has dealt with those. You passed the first stage, it's gone to the second stage. Negotiations are now opening. So that is a great engine for dealing with corruption and other systemic problems in Ukraine itself. And thirdly, I'd say nobody should point the finger at corruption from Russia, because Russia is hideously corrupt. And every part of the Russian state has been eaten alive by corruption. Hence, we've seen arrests in the Ministry of Defence of those around former Defence Minister Shoigu, who have just been raping the Russian military budget for years and years and years. So, yes, it's an issue. Yes, it can be addressed with the political will to do so. In fact, I think the Ukrainian people themselves, in the future bargain between state and and people will demand greater measures to go after these oligarchs who have been robbing them blind in Ukraine for years.